All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are cracking open a psychological detective story that's over 100 years old. It's all about the very first time science found a way to read our deepest secrets, not from our words, but from the silent language our own bodies are speaking all the time. I mean, think about it for a second. Can your own body, your own skin even, betray the thoughts you're trying so hard to hide? Or maybe even thoughts you don't realize you have? It sounds like science fiction, but how would you even begin to measure something like that? Well, every good mystery starts with a weird clue, right? And this one is no different. Imagine someone's hooked up to a machine in an experiment. You say a totally neutral word to them, like apple, and you see on the chart their physical reaction is tiny, barely a blip. But then you say another word, something that seems completely innocent, like pretty, and bam, the machine goes wild, showing this massive, undeniable spike. The real question is, what's hiding behind that spike?
So to figure out what's going on, we gotta jump in the time machine and head back to 1906. There's a doctor in a Swiss lab, a guy named Verguth, and he's fiddling with a device called a galvanometer. He's passing a tiny, harmless current through a person's skin, just measuring electrical changes. He thought he was just studying basic physiology. Little did he know he was about to stumble onto a key that could unlock the human mind itself.
Okay, so he gave his discovery the super technical name, the galvano-psychophysical reflex. Don't worry about the name. What it meant was absolutely revolutionary. He figured out that anytime a person felt any kind of emotion, any feeling at all, the electrical resistance on their skin would suddenly drop. For the first time in history, an internal, subjective feeling could be seen as an objective, measurable line on a graph. And this is where things get really wild. The size of that jolt on the machine, it had nothing to do with how loud the sound was or how strong the stimulus was. No, a quiet little whisper could cause a way bigger reaction than a loud bang. Why? Because the machine wasn't measuring the outside world. It was measuring the inner world. It was literally picking up the physical echo of a feeling, of a thought that hit a hidden sensitive nerve. So, of course, this incredible discovery gets noticed by none other than the brilliant psychologist Carl Jung. And for him, it was like the final piece of a puzzle he'd been wrestling with for years. He realized if he paired this physical measurement with his psychological tests, he'd have a toolkit that could actually map the uncharted territory of the unconscious mind. The method he used, the word association test, is actually beautiful in its simplicity. Here's how it worked. Step 1. An examiner says a word, a stimulus word. Step 2. The person has to say the very first word that pops into their head. No filtering, no thinking. Step 3. You time the response right down to the fraction of a second. And then the really clever part, step 4. Later on, after it's all over, you ask them to remember the words they said. It seems simple, but the genius was in spotting the cracks that showed up under pressure. And this, right here, is where Jung's inner detective really came out to play. He saw that for normal, neutral words, people were fast, logical, and they remembered their answers easily. But whenever a word touched on what he called a complex, basically an emotional hotspot, the whole system would just glitch. The reaction time would suddenly get longer, the word they chose would be strange, and very often they'd completely forget what they said. These weren't just mistakes, they were like big, flashing signposts pointing directly to a secret. Let me show you a real-world example of this in action. It's pretty powerful. During one test, a woman showed a major complex around all these words you see here: water, ship, lake. Her reaction times were long, and she couldn't recall her answers later. So Jung sees this pattern, and he gently asks her about it. And that's when the story comes out. She confessed that just recently she had seriously considered taking her own life by drowning. The test didn't just flag a few words. It found the deep, painful source of her trauma. Okay, so now that we get how the test works, let's go back to our original mystery. Let's solve the case of the newlywed and that huge reaction to one single, simple word. And that word, if you remember, was pretty. Just an everyday adjective. But the second this young guy heard it, boom, the reaction was huge, both from him and from the machine. So, out loud, he says something kind of defensive. Not pretty. But his body? Oh, his body told a completely different story. The needle on that galvanometer shot up, creating this massive, long-lasting spike that hung around for the next few words. His mouth was saying one thing, but his skin was screaming the truth. So, what was going on? What was the secret? Well, Jung quickly learned the man had only been married for a week.
And with a little gentle probing, it all came out. The man was deeply insecure about his new wife's appearance, and it all spilled out in this one heartbreaking sentence he said. "Other people do not find her very pretty, but for me, she is quite pretty enough." That word, pretty, wasn't just a word for him. It was a direct hit on his biggest, most current insecurity. It was his sore point.
And you can see why Jung thought this was so important. He said, this experiment was a good means of fathoming and of analyzing the personality. This wasn't just a party trick. It was a scientific tool to map out the hidden landscape of a person's mind, to find the powerful emotional centers that secretly guide everything we do. But this wasn't just about uncovering, social anxieties. This technique could dig much, much deeper. Let's look at one last case. And this one is even more dramatic. It shows just how far this method could reach into the darkest corners of someone's past.
All right, so this next guy, he claims he's a total teetotaler, never touches alcohol. But the data tells a very different story. The word restaurant triggers non-alcoholic and a spike. Polished triggers glass and another spike. And then the German word for full, which can also mean drunk, triggers man and another huge spike. You see the pattern here, right? A clear and troubling theme was emerging.
So, faced with this undeniable physical evidence from his own body, the man finally told the truth. Years before, in a drunken rage, he had committed a violent assault that landed him a long prison sentence. He said the event was a lasting impression that became a great social hindrance in his life. He became a complete abstainer just to make sure that part of him could never come out again. This test didn't just find a secret he was hiding. It found the absolute bedrock trauma of his entire life. It's incredible when you think about the legacy of this discovery, right? Something that started back in 1906. As you can see, these early experiments are basically the granddaddy of the modern polygraph, the lie detector test. But maybe even more importantly, the core idea, using the body's reactions to map out our inner world, well, that still influences therapy today, helping people access the unconscious stuff that shapes who they are. And the craziest part? It all boils down to this tiny, almost invisible delay. That 1 to 6 second gap between hearing a word and having a physical reaction. That little pocket of time, that's how long it takes for a thought to go in your ear, dive deep into your unconscious, hit a nerve, and then send a signal all the way back out to your skin. You could almost call it the speed of a secret. So when you look at the big picture, this was never really just about catching people in a lie. It was something so much bigger. For the first time ever, science had built a bridge between the mind and the body. It gave us an objective window into our own unconscious, a way to actually see the things we couldn't say. And that, of course, leaves us with one last, kind of personal question. If we hooked you up to that machine right now, what simple, everyday words would make that needle jump? What are the hidden sore points that your body knows about, even if you don't?